Hey, so my name is Dave Balmer. I wrote this framework called Joe because I figured there weren't enough mobile frameworks out there in the world right now based on HTML5. I actually started development on this about a year ago, so it's been kind of percolating behind the scenes. You can applaud early. That's okay. That's fine. Okay, so yeah, I've been kind of lurking in the JavaScript community for some time now. So this is my first open source JavaScript project. Mostly I get paid by people to do things that, you know, stay proprietary and hidden behind the scenes. So yeah, I've been programming a while. Pretty much a geek. So I'll just move on. So yeah, what is Joe? Joe is a application framework for mobile devices. Most of the cool smartphones today have either WebView with WebKit or something very much WebKit-like. So I took a look around at some of the older frameworks that have been kicking around and some of the things that I'd done in the past and kind of wondered what would an application framework, specifically a UI framework, look like if you just started from scratch and said, well, if I don't have to support IE 6, 7, or 8, you know, can you write a smaller framework? Can you leverage some of the cool stuff that's in the CSS3 and all this thing that we're calling HTML5? And turns out you can end up with a pretty small library. So Joe has a pretty robust set of widgets, a simple data layer. And gzipped and minified, it's kicking around 12K. And if you want to do, it'll work with basically anything except IE, anything before IE9. It's actually working with IE9 pretty well these days. It's designed to work with PhoneGap. So how many people are familiar with PhoneGap for mobile development? All right. Okay, Brian LaRue is very happy. So Joe is designed to sit for mobile applications on top of PhoneGap. So as you may know with PhoneGap, basically what it gives you is sort of a baseline compatibility layer between all the different mobile OSs out there. But what it doesn't bring to the party is sort of all the cool native-like widgets and controls for putting an app together. So Joe is designed to sort of sit on top of that really great layer. So anyway, this is, you know, the pretty typical block diagram of, you know, the architecture. Pretty simple. Joe is a very lightweight framework, so you don't have to use it for everything. If you want to fiddle with the DOM directly, because you have some last-minute hacky thing that you have to do for your app to get it out the door, go right ahead. Joe's certainly not going to get in the way. It has no dependencies on any other libraries. So the big plus there is that you don't run into any incompatibilities. So if you want to mix in other libs to get your app together, Joe's not going to get in your way. If you're using PhoneGap with iOS and Android, basically, for those that haven't used PhoneGap, it allows you to create installable, native-ish mobile apps that use HTML5 technology. So on these platforms, iOS and Android, PhoneGap will give you sort of a web view, and then sort of a native app wrapper. And then inside that web view, you can put your JavaScript HTML5 CSS app. And then some other mobile platforms. So I work at HP. That's my day job. How many people are familiar with WebOS? OK, cool. Cool. That's actually, yeah. All right, that's a lot of hands. Cool. So what's cool about WebOS is something like PhoneGap is there mostly as a compatibility layer. WebOS native apps are basically web apps, or at least they use web technology. So kind of, I don't know, flashback to when the iPhone came out. I was a big fan, mostly because Apple got up in front of everybody and said, hey, does anybody remember what they said? Right, web apps. So basically Apple said the web is the SDK. This is, you know, new breed of smartphone. You don't need a special SDK. All you need are web apps. So I was all on board with that and got well underway writing a few apps. And then they sort of came back a year later and said, well, web is the SDK except for this new thing that we're calling the actual SDK for Apple. So I still bear maybe a little bit of bitterness towards that. And so when WebOS came around and actually said the web is the SDK and then actually, you know, came through on that promise, that definitely attracted me over to HP to work on that. Joe is also open source. It has a free BSD license, so you can pretty much do anything you want with it. And I'm really hoping to actually get a lot more code contributors. I've had a few so far who have mostly done a few bug fixes, added a few pieces here and there. But Joe has reached the size where, to sort of get it out there and get it to beta and have it go live, definitely would like to find a couple more folks who are really enthusiastic about the approach that I'm taking with this library and have a little spare time on their hands to chip in. So I'm going to go over real quick the basic philosophy behind Joe, because it's a little different. So just sort of show of hands, like how many people are familiar with, say, Sencha Touch? Okay, that's not bad. Sencha Touch is relatively new. What about jQuery Mobile? Okay, actually about the same, about 50-50 between the two. So to me, these sort of represent sort of the two polar extremes of what we have out there right now with sort of HTML5 based mobile technologies. You've got jQuery on the one side, which jQuery Mobile does pretty much what jQuery did, except they have like sort of a mobile widget library laying on top of it. And if you code in jQuery Mobile, you spend a lot of time more on the HTML side, and then you sort of add the JavaScript kind of as you go, that's one approach. And then on the other end of the stream, you've got something like Sencha Touch, which is similar to, say, Sprout Core, or even going back to Dojo, which is more JavaScript centric. So you're using JavaScript to create your app. The fact that there's sort of a DOM in there is sort of a means to the end rather than a focus. So Joe leans a little bit more towards the Sencha Touch side, but I'll get into this in a second here. But yeah, I'm going to skip a slide and come back. So what a lot of these frameworks that are very JavaScript heavy tend to do is come to our platform saying, well, JavaScript, parts of it are kind of hard. Prototypal inheritance is tough, and gosh, we come from a better language that has proper classes and things like that. So a lot of frameworks will create these really sort of intricate patterns and machinations to sort of create what I call a sort of an other language experience inside JavaScript. These libraries do some cool stuff, but that's never really set too well with me. I happen to actually love JavaScript at its core. It's my personal belief that if WebKit were more up to snuff today, we really wouldn't need sort of any UI frameworks whatsoever. And even though I wrote one, I'm actually genuinely hoping that sometime in the next 5 years or so, we'll all be using Vapor.js basically to get our apps done. So between now and absolute adoption of Vapor.js, we have something like Joe. Joe has a lot of the things that I like. One of the things that I really appreciate about jQuery is method chaining. It took me a little bit to really enjoy that way of doing things, but it's very handy. I also have constructor nesting in here, and I'll show that off in a minute when we get to the code stuff. But basically, a lot of stuff that's in Crockford's, JavaScript, the good parts. Show of hands, everyone should know this book, right? JavaScript, the good parts? Okay, yeah. So all of the good part stuff, Joe is pretty much in line with. I agree with about 95% of what is in Crockford's book. And so a few old favorites like Observer Pattern, which is all over YUI, particularly YUI 2. And for those folks who are big fans of bind, I support it. If you don't want to do that, all of the event handling, you can pass in a context as an optional parameter. So Joe tries to be pretty accommodating. So in addition to not trying to fix JavaScript, rather than having a bunch of JavaScript to animate things on the screen, hey, require CSS3, use the transformations and the transitions that are built into it. And the reason that's important, particularly when we go with mobile, is you have slower machines. They have less memory available for you to do funky things like manually move things around. Not to mention, some OSs out there kind of throttle the timer interval that you can use in your apps. So you may find that you can only move things, 10 times a second, for example, if you're to, manually go through and move things around yourself. Another goal with Joe is to keep the code light, as absolutely small as possible, without making it completely unreadable. So to sort of sum it up, I like to think if Joe were a person, Joe would be Indiana Jones. Basically all the cool stuff you can think about Indiana, and then maybe, maybe that'll sort of get you sort of in the mindset. Basically, like Indy, smart, flexible, lightweight, can dress up if he needs to. Indy will wear a tux, if the occasion, requires. Same thing with Joe. If you want your app to look extremely, special and yours and branded and all that other cool marketing speak, just go to the CSS and tweak it. Make it look the way that you want. You don't have to just use all the default styles that come with all the widgets. And gets the job done, again, as quickly as possible. So having said that, and this goes back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier, today it's more like the young Indiana Jones, basically showing a lot of promise. And I think when we get into the code and some of the examples, you can definitely see that it's off to a good start. A little bit rough around the edges. Again, definitely trying to round up some more code participation in this to help take it. Right now it's pre-beta, so at least to take it to beta and hopefully get it shippable. Okay, we'll do a quick comparison. So this is the obligatory size comparison chart. And for those of you who are not in a food coma, because we just ate lunch, may notice something looks a little fishy here. This is using my favorite size comparison metric, which is the number of bytes that it takes in the name of the framework. So in this case, you can see Joe only takes 2 bytes, or 2 characters for the Unicode folks. XUI, very lightweight, takes 3, Zepto 5, and on down. Now, I think jQuery Mobile would have been a lot smaller if they'd left the word mobile off of it. Same thing with SensorTouch. But in all seriousness, so this is a bit more serious comparison. This is sort of give you kind of a mental map if you're familiar with the mobile framework landscape that's out there. So on the top of the chart, we have more minimal sorts of frameworks, and Zepto and XUI are sort of what I would consider to be sort of jQuery light. They're very, very small, and if what you want to do is manipulate the DOM sort of by hand in your JavaScript, these are fantastic libraries for doing that across platform. And then sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got SensorTouch, Sprout Core, Dojo Mobile has come out recently. They tend to be a bit bigger. They tend to be a bit more ambitious as far as what they're trying to do. And they tend to sort of take the approach of, here's how your app is laid out, and sort of inject your logic into our framework. So they tend to use the word framework very seriously. I tend to use it more in terms of features rather than trying to direct the way that you code your app up. So I like to think that Joe sort of occupies kind of a sweet spot between those 2 spectrums. And then over here, you've got jQuery Mobile. jQuery Mobile is a bit bigger than something like Zepto and XUI, but they're trying to do a lot more. They're trying to support not just smartphones, but feature phones, and not just installed apps, but the browsers on these different phones, which can vary wildly in quality. But again, they have a very different approach in the way that they do that. So anyway, I'll move on. And so let's get into some code examples. This is actually a really terrible example, but it gives you an idea of where you would start with Joe. Basically, you're setting up an empty index HTML. You're loading in the CSS, and then if you have application CSS on top of that, you load that too. You load in the framework, and then you code up your app, which is pretty simple. It's like, for example, you'll notice I'm using the new keyword. I happen to like it. I happen to like prototypal inheritance. There's some really nice built-in stuff in JavaScript that deals with its natural way of handling, well, not really classes, but classes and inheritance. So I'm a firm believer that if you're writing JavaScript, you shouldn't break things like instance of, which can be very useful. So I'm going to pop out of this and into an actual editor. And while I'm doing that, do we have any I can throw in like a couple of quick questions if anybody has one? Not yet. Okay. You want to see the code first. I understand. Yeah, slides are not enough. Okay. So, and by the way, all of this stuff, I didn't know how good our Wi-Fi would be. Actually, I have to say, this is one of the better Wi-Fi situations that I've seen in a conference, like in the last year. So that's really cool. Yeah, round of applause for the Wi-Fi. But I am prepared, so if for some reason you can't connect for whatever reason, I have flash drives to pass around with all of this stuff on it. Okay, cool. So let's pop up, say, a really simple sample. Can everybody read that? Do I need to bump the font size up a bit? Okay. Someone said yes, so I'm going to comply. How about that? Readable? Anyone can't read? Put your hands up. Awesome. So they can either read it perfectly or they're too embarrassed to put their hands up. Either way, it's good for me. Okay, cool. So here we have sort of the shell. And this is an old example, so those of you who are actually paying attention, don't look at what I just deleted. It's old doc type 401 strict. Good old 401 strict, right? Yeah, okay. So we don't need that anymore. So I have a lot of funky stuff in here, which I've set up in this index HTML. Basically, all of these meta tags here are for iOS. And a couple of them for Android, and WebOS actually uses them too. This sets up the viewport and makes sure that the app actually shows up at the proper resolution and all that type of good stuff. So we have the standard style sheet with Joe. I have a special style sheet that I did for the sample app, which I'll show you in a second. And I'm going to move this guy up here. And for those who actually are using iOS and want to take this from a web app and make it an offline running web app, yeah, there you go. There's a little icon to do that. So anyway, I'm just tagging on to onload here because I'm lazy. And I'm calling my app load. And then I've got the Joe JS script, and then I've got the YQL JS script. So the index HTML page, well, not page, but the file is actually just sort of an empty shell, empty canvas, and puts all the pieces together. And okay, cool. So this is the actual business end of this app. The way that I chose to code this one up is using sort of the object literal or the singleton pattern. Joe doesn't really judge. Joe doesn't really care how you write your application. If you want to do your app all based on, if you want to make it functional, that's fine. If you want to use sort of this pattern, that's fine. If you like the module pattern, that's great. Like Joe doesn't really care. So as far as setting up your application's architecture, I mean, that's up to you. I mean, I really don't feel like it's the framework's business to tell you, how to put together your app. I feel very strongly about that. So single call to this thing called Joe load. And then I've got, Joe has a built-in control, which makes it a little bit easier to make YQL calls. How many people are familiar with YQL? Yahoo's awesome query language service. You can shout and cheer because it is awesome. Yeah, woohoo! Okay, I'll do it for you. So we got two boots for that. So what YQL does is it's sort of like SQL, but for the web. So any sort of data that's out there, preferably XML-ish or JSON-ish, it can sort of put them together, data from disparate resources, put them together into something that your app can digest more easily. So here, basically setting a YQL select, and it is a lot like SQL. So select title from RSS where, and then I'm giving it this URL. And RSS happens to be a service that comes bundled with YQL. Basically, it'll pull the data off of any RSS feed that you give it. And so this particular example, I'm doing sort of long form. So in other words, I'm sort of creating each element as I go along and then putting them together later. Again, Joe doesn't care if you want to do it sort of this way, and I'll show you a slicker way to do it in a minute. So here I'm creating a new list widget, so new Joe list. And I'm passing in YQL. Joe YQL is it's an extension of a base class that's in Joe called Joe Data Source. And what that does is essentially, basically it wraps an array of objects of whatever that you want. So the list control happens to accept a data source. So in this case, we're passing in YQL. And what that means is that whenever YQL, the response goes out and then comes back with the data, this list control that we've just defined, will get notified of that data, and then it will be told to present that data. The next line here, we've got list.formatItem equals blah, blah, blah. So if you want to do this sort of, the right way, you could create your own application-specific version of Joe list, which I'll show you how to do that in a second. Basically, if you're familiar with the extend method that's in JavaScript, the good parts, it's really similar to that. But if you're really lazy, you can just make a new Joe list and then sort of override its format item function. And so the format item method basically takes data from each of the array elements, and its job is to turn that into some DOM nodes or an HTML fragment for the list view itself to turn around and present. Pretty straightforward. We've got a button that we're creating. You notice here we're starting to get a little bit of our chaining. So we've got a new button. We're giving it a title of Go, and all of these widgets have different types of events that they publish. Button has one called select event. So I'm going to subscribe to that select event, and I'm going to tell it whenever that happens, I want it to call a method that's in my app called refresh. And because I don't really like bind that much, I'm going to pass along a reference to this app object up here. Even more lazy coding. So adding to the chain here, I've got a set style. So this is an example of, a lot of, the sort of far end extreme of widget sort of oriented frameworks. They don't really want you messing around with sort of the nitty gritty DOM elements. They want you to use their widgets and do things the right way and extend it and add stuff to it and things like that. Joe is perfectly fine with letting you sort of fiddle with things on the fly. In this particular example, this wouldn't exactly be what you call production code. But if you're trying to put together a quick prototype and you have to make a quick tweak because someone from your product team or, if you're a consultant, your client walks by and says, gosh, what would it look like if we changed the color blue? You can do that really quickly without having to fiddle with your CSS. OK, so setting up a new button. So that's everything we need to do for setting up the button. We're setting up just an empty variable right now for input. And this is an example of constructor nesting that I was talking about. So sort of like method chaining in that it's kind of slick. It can look really cool if you know what it's doing, and it can look mildly confusing if you've never seen it before. But the advantage is that when you're done, you actually get a feel for the structure of your UI. So this would be something akin to if you did this with a templating language or with straight HTML, you'd actually sort of see the structure of what elements contain what, et cetera, et cetera. So here we're creating a new screen. Screen is defined by default to sort of fill the interior area of whatever container it's in. So in this case, we're actually just filling the window itself, whatever size it may be. We're creating a container within it, and then we have this thing called flex row. So flex row just uses the flexible box model. So again, one of the nice things about doing mobile apps is you tend to have more feature support for a lot of the newer CSS3 and things like that. Doing input, and again, another little set style just for fun, and list. So if we look at this main thing, Joe Screen, we'll see that we're passing in, really what this is just an array. There's an array of different widgets that are being passed in. So I'll show you real quick what this looks like. Okay, I'm going to resend the phrase real quick and just downgrade it to shortly. Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay, cool. So we open this up, and we get something pretty simple. We don't have any scrollers set up, so it's using whatever native scroller you happen to have on your system. So if you're setting this up, say on iOS, inside of one web page, you just have, your page would just sort of scroll from end to end. And as you can see in the browser, we're just using the native scroller. Really doesn't do much beyond that. Allows you to change this. Who has an RSS feed they want me to pull up? Short. It has to be short. What? Shorter. This was a bad idea. I can't type any of these things. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Yes, basically you give it an RSS feed. It runs through YQL using the Joe YQL wrapper class that we have, and then pushes it through the UI that we have defined. So that's a pretty simple example. Any questions so far in this one? Because it had to introduce a lot of Joeisms. None yet. Okay, you want to see more code. I get it. All right. So this is the sort of old kitchen sink sample. And if you notice doing this, we're actually writing mobile apps right now, even though we're sitting inside the browser. The nice thing about that, if anyone who's done mobile app development, debugging on device or even in an emulator can be challenging, particularly in some cases using web-based technology, actually even getting console log to come out and see what's going on, much less being able to step through and debug things. So the nice thing is that you can get your app most of the way done inside the browser and then use the debugger that's built into Chrome or Safari, Firefox. Okay, so this is a pretty simple sort of kitchen sink. So we've got our little physics-based stuff. All that's done with CSS3. And really all that Joe is doing is altering the class name of the elements that are being scrolled around. The big advantage with that is, well, one, using CSS3, it's going to, in many cases, use hardware acceleration that's built onto the device. So you're going to get a lot smoother action out of it. And the other thing, too, is that you can alter the way, the physics, sort of, that you set up in the scroller by tweaking the CSS, rather than digging around in your JavaScript. So this page just shows off some of the different widgets. This is like a pull-down widget. This is sort of a toggle, on or off. This is a pull-down that has, arbitrary fields, whatever you want to put in it. We've got buttons, et cetera, et cetera. This one looks rather boring unless you see what it's doing underneath. What this is doing is it's loading in HTML snippets from another place. So if you wanted to, say, do a help system, you basically give it an HTML file and tell it to render as one of these cards. So we'll back up a little bit here. Options. Basically fills it up however you want. Text fields work pretty much like you'd expect. And all of the stuff is themable and skinnable completely in CSS3. For the main project CSS for Joe, I use less CSS. Anybody familiar with that one? It's kind of like Sass. Okay, so some hands. All right. So it's a CSS compiler. Makes it a little bit easier to do things like themes and such. Expandable text area, blah, blah, blah. Fairly simple table control. Basically has event handlers for when the user interacts with it, like if they tap on a cell and such like that. You can set up you can subscribe to that event with any methods that you want. It uses an event model similar to YUI 2, which is sort of the observer pattern. So you can have as many controls or as many arbitrary hunks of your code subscribing to anything that you want, basically, and you can sort of chain up behaviors based on that. Here's an example of using Flexbox type stuff to do, like, say, a TV remote app. Ignore this part down here. And then this is an example of an on-demand view. Again, this page is kind of boring unless you know what it's doing behind the scenes, which I'll show you real quickly. So Joe has a sort of a convenience wrapper for defining something like a card view or a set of UI widgets without actually having to instantiate them until you need them. And so I'll show you that in a second. And of course, pop-ups. You have to have pop-ups in any library. All right, so let's get into the code. I'm actually not going to do the whole code for this because there's kind of a bunch, but I'm going to touch on some of the more interesting bits. So in this particular one, setting up using more of the module pattern. Bum, 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 lots of comments explaining what's going on, lots of commented out code. So this is the original kitchen sink demo, so there's a lot of commented code that's been commented out. So here's an example of creating a new card called, in this case, menu. And I've defined, I did var menu up above, so I'm just putting this in line too. So we're creating a new card. Inside that card, we have a list. Inside that list, we have this data. We're just coding it inline because it's static. We're setting a title for it, and so that's our menu. And then we're setting up a handler for whenever this menu gets activated. What we want to do is to tell the list to deselect whatever item was selected last time. And that basically gives us this card right here, that code we just looked at. Setting up our screen, using a flex column. Now what the flex column does is allows us to have this thing sitting at the top and the thing floating down at the bottom, which can be interesting on iOS. Basically, there's a lot of hacks out there, some of which involve giving up and doing native controls for any of the headers and the toolbar down below. But you don't have to do that. Joe Scroller actually performs very well on iOS. So it works pretty well. Okay. Defer, login. Okay, so these are more sort of static things. Okay, here we go. So here's that UI mechanism that I was talking about, where you can sort of define a hunk of UI without actually instantiating it until you need it. So there's a thing called Joe Cache, and you can set, basically, you give it some sort of name, a string, and you give it a handler function that gets called the first time that this particular hunk of UI is requested with the joecache.get. And then it stores a response to that, so any subsequent calls to it, it'll just return whatever was returned from the first call. Does that make sense? Nobody raised their hand. Okay, so I'll show you real quick. Here's a couple more. Joe Cache set. So whenever we do Joe Cache get, Joe Cache get text area. So we can do something, well, who can spot that typo? So something like if we have our UI stack, we can push this onto it. And what that'll do is, since we've designed this thing down below, text area, the first time that this gets called, the stack push Joe cache get, it's going to go look up our property for text area, and it's going to say, well, this hasn't been called before, so I'm going to call this function. And the function, all it does is return some sort of UI widget. In this case, we're returning card. Another thing to note too, just going back into the whole, Joe isn't trying to get in between you and getting the job done. The common unit of currency that you'll see being thrown around with all this UI stuff are basically Joe widgets and Joe views. They can just as easily be HTML pieces. So you can feed it a DOM node directly, and it'll sort of roll with that as well. So if you have some sort of thing that doesn't really match any sort of control, it's something that you've sort of created on your own, you can feed that in as well, and it'll handle it. It'll resolve all that for you. So a little more stuff here. But again, you can see more of that sort of inline sugar for creating these things. Now, you'll see this type of structure in things like Send to Touch. What they do is sort of create sort of a JSON blob with a lot of properties and some string flags and things like that in there. I like the structure, but I prefer it to be closer to the metal. So if you notice, we sort of have the nested structure, but we're actually creating these objects on the fly. So we're still actually coding in JavaScript. We're not pushing it through some sort of framework. And in fact, if you wanted to code this up without putting it in the sort of hierarchy network, it's perfectly fine. You can create each of these pieces and then inject them in whatever fashion suits your coding style. Cool. This is the remote thing. Okay. All right. Makes sense so far? I saw 2 people nod. Okay, cool. Okay. So let's take a look at a quick sample app that does a little bit more than these little prototype thingies. Oh, see, again, and some more applause for the Wi-Fi. That worked beautifully. So what this sample app does is it looks up all the traffic incidents that are centered around a particular area. In this particular case, we're looking for anything that's within 100 miles of, say, New York City, because we want a nice, decently sized list to scroll through. Then when you tap on one of them, you get sort of this detailed view. In this case, we're pulling down a view from Google Maps. If you click on that, it actually pulls up the Google Maps page itself. Not as impressive on the browser. So in your mobile app, it'll actually typically be able to launch if you have a map application, it'll launch that map app. All right. There's a little more stuff here. If you notice, we've got, so you can manually refresh it, all that other type of good stuff. So this same app, and I don't want to go through all the different platforms, but basically you can take the same app and run it in a dozen different places. And by places, I mean different sorts of platforms, including a few that you wouldn't expect. So after the talk, sometime later today, if you go to joapp.com, and I'll have the URL up at the end, I have like a 10-minute video that does sort of a demo of the same app, pretty much this same app running on about 8 different things. And again, the same code underneath, so sort of write once. Well, I won't say write once, run everywhere. I'll say write once and debug everywhere. Each platform has like a little, some eccentricities. One of the design goals with Joe is to limit most of those eccentricities on the CSS level. And it's been largely successful with that. So let's take the same app. All right. So this is the same app, and I've got folders set up for running in the browser, for Android, dashboard widgets, which I'll show in a second, running on iPhone, iPad, mobile Safari. This is a slight tweak in the index.html for that, and then WebOS. And I happen to have the emulator up for WebOS, which is, of course, my absolute favorite mobile platform. Disclosure, I work for HP, but I was actually a huge fan before I started, so I feel fair and honest in saying that. Okay, cool. So we have this emulator running WebOS 2.0. All right, so we packaged it. So these are some command line tools for getting apps. Basically builds the app package and then installs it on the device or the emulator. And here we go. Here's our commuter app. So again, same app, running on 2 different platforms. Joe also does some other things too. Some platforms will require a back button, others won't. For example, WebOS has WebOS 2 anyway has a back gesture on the device, which so you notice it won't actually put a back button, and we'll maybe show another example of that in a minute. Okay. Actually, how much time do I have left?
You're about done.
I'm about done. I'm about done. So let me go back real quick. Okay, Q&A session. So any questions? Why on earth would I do this? That sort of thing. Yes, up here? Question is, have I gotten it to work with Backbone? I have not played with it. I don't see why it wouldn't work with it, though. And I think somebody over at Nitobi was talking about playing with that. So somebody somewhere has it working with Backbone. Just not me yet. Any other questions? Oh, what about Enyo? Yeah, so Enyo is a really cool framework that HP has put out. Mac McNulty's team is putting that together over at HP. Enyo is really designed for, I want to say, larger, more enterprise-type apps. That's a very comprehensive framework, and it has all the pluses and minuses that you get with a larger framework like that. Generally, if you're doing larger apps, you would probably want a larger framework to get the job done. There's some conceptual similarities. Enyo is the same thing as Joe. You know, you start with an empty index.html and let JavaScript create all the stuff. Okay, so this is actually, yeah, so the question is Enyo versus, really you're talking Mojo. For those that started with WebOS when it first came out, there's a framework called Mojo. Please do not confuse Joe with Mojo in any shape, form at all. Mojo is something that we're trying to move away from at HP. You know, we really appreciate the developers that started working with it, but Enyo is our official framework, and it's a heck of a lot better. But yeah, as far as Joe versus Enyo, Joe's just lighter weight, and it's geared, I think, more for different types of apps and different types of coders. Any others? Any more? Any more? Okay, cool. I think I am done. Thank you guys very, very much. If you want to get more info, go to joeweb.com and see me after if you want to get a copy of this, again, if Wi-Fi is not working for you. Cool. Thank you.
Did you remember the baby?
Oh, no.